What's going on, Mo? We out here. It's another late night at Dames, and this evening we're gonna get into reading the big old beautiful bill. But before we get into that, let's snatch this away. I want to make sure you guys are hitting the like button if you enjoy conversations like this, and also hit the subscribe button if you want to see more content like this and just catch all my other crazy things that I get into in my music career. So the big beautiful bill, essentially what it is, it has been passed into law, is a giant big broad bill that covers a whole bunch of different issues that some people either agree with the parts that will affect them, disagree with the parts that don't, disagree with the parts that affect them, and agree with the parts that don't. So there's a lot of polarizing contentions with this big old bill. But we're going to kind of focus on some of those contentions, and I really just want to break down how to read these things and how to understand it, because it's not necessarily a pick of right or wrong, because that's up to the people. The people get to vote for who decides what goes into law. So if you are educated in what you're voting on, then you will be an informed voter. And if you're voting on people to represent you in an integral way, then you should have nothing to worry about, because this is what you voted for. Or you have nothing to worry about because this is the process you voted for. So we just need to understand how this works. And this is going to be key for artists and musicians, because you would then understand the landscape you're navigating through, called the United States, that of which, most of us reside in that are watching this. But the idea is essentially to increase your understanding of how things work in the overall and overarching position you play as a citizen in the country you live in. So another reason why this is going to be important is because many musicians, especially ones that are watching this channel, you want to be successful, you want to make money, you want to make a living, or you want to have an estate built from the catalog that you're developing. And if you don't want to do any of that, then you probably want to leave a mark, right? But if for any reason you're watching this and you think that you want some kind of success, well, part of that success is going to be understanding the game you're playing. Understanding the game is a little bit more than just hitting the right notes on your guitar. Excuse me, hitting the right notes on your guitar. It's going to be really about understanding who's listening to you play the guitar and then why do they want to listen to it, right? So if you realize that you're in a position where you may be marketing to a certain demographic, you can kind of speak to who they are and you may be able to help them in certain situations. But if you don't understand these things, or maybe you can't get insight on their perspective on things, then it will be difficult to do that. And this is usually hard for artists that struggle with kind of experiencing the world before they play their instrument, in a sense, meaning you lack a little bit of life before you start writing, love songs and things like that. So it comes from kind of a good place, but it's usually misguided because you don't have all the information. So the point of this live stream is to kind of exercise that. We're going to dive a little bit into something that we may agree with, may not agree with, and we might learn something from this. But the key about this whole experience is so that you know how to do this, right? So the main thing we're going to do here, because of in the theme of our last episode where we talked about how AI can be used for musicians, we're going to actually use AI to help us break this down, because this is a 900-page bill that has been passed into a law and we don't have time to do that. So we're going to do what we can to get as much poignant and key information about the bill, and then we will then open it up to where you can now make your own conclusions or dive further into issues that may be more important to you. So the first thing I would really have to look at is, what is this big old bill? Like, in general, what is it, right? And the idea behind it is essentially to help the country function a little bit more efficiently based on this current administration's perspective, which includes everybody, Republicans, Democrats, and everybody in between. So you're going to see some stuff that will make sense in one mindset and not really make sense in another mindset, and we will kind of explore what these mindsets are, because many of the things that you will see in these laws and bills and things like that, even going forward, like in future bills and laws, will be kind of just options. They're not necessarily, chains laid across your body. They're just simply options for you to use, and you'll kind of understand it as we go into it. So let's pull it up here. So we're using our good old pal Gemini. We got to find a nickname for you, Gemini, that's something cute and feminine. But essentially, I've pretty much asked it, what are the key points of the big beautiful bill that people have most contention with? And it basically would take a lot of information from either Google, social media sites, and even articles, and just kind of grab a general understanding of the contentions here. But we would still have to go in and have conversations with people, see what they think, and of course look at the bill ourselves and then see what we think, right? But in general, this is what we come up with when we look at this. So the first thing it says is cuts to social safety net programs, especially Medicaid and SNAP. And before we get to that, I did skip the first paragraph where it says, it's recently passed by Congress and signed into law, generating significant controversy and intense debate. And like we said, the first one is that it cuts social safety net programs, especially Medicaid and SNAP. So the first one we're going to look at is Medicaid. This arguably is the most contentious aspect, which is that the bill implements significant cuts to Medicaid, the government health program for low income and disabled Americans. And this includes new work requirements, which are imposing work requirements for some able-bodied adult Medicaid recipients, which critics argue will cause millions to lose coverage, including vulnerable populations. So when I hear that, I immediately think imposing work requirements for some able-bodied adult. So an able-bodied adult would be like somebody like me who can get up, get a job, work, and do the what is it? It's like, can you lift 60 pounds? It asks you on the resume, right? So you're able bodied, you can fill out that resume, but you're still receiving Medicaid, right? So they're imposing a work requirement for those kinds of Medicaid people. So if you can work, then they probably have a stipulation for how much you need to work or maybe how much you need to make in order to maintain coverage or probably to push you towards getting off of coverage eventually. And so it says critics argue this will cause millions to lose coverage, including vulnerable populations. So right there, that makes me kind of wonder who would be the vulnerable populations if you're an able-bodied adult on Medicaid, right? So if you're able-bodied, that would assume you have pretty much the functionality to do said work they're requiring of you. So let's try and figure out who that might necessarily be here. And I think I have the bill here that I can pull up. No, it's actually, I have it, but it's not going to be easy to find the specific section I'm looking for. Let's see if I can search it. I think we can search it. Yes, Lord. Okay, so let's see. I believe we can search within the bill. No, this is a different bill. Yeah, this is a different bill. All right, so let's go back. And we will search by the sections. Okay, here we go. They have the sections. So when you're looking at the bill, I'm actually pull it up for you so you can see as I do this. All right, so let's close this. And then we're going to open the literal bill. Boom, this is the bill. So when your parents ask you, did you read the bill? This is what it looks like. All right, so as you're scrolling down, the first thing we're going to look for is the table of contents. And this will show you pretty much all the sections. And this is what kind of is the problem with having a bill this big. There is so many different sections that goes into this that in order to kind of like make it all make sense in a reasonable amount of time is very difficult because of all these sections. I'm still scrolling. This is still the table of contents, right? So that's one criticism of this bill that a lot of people have, which makes, some fair sense that this is pretty bloated. Like you kind of want to take your time and walk through this, being that it's going to affect so many people in so many ways, right? So we're not going to go through all of these because, again, if we need Congress to do it, I'm not going to do it on a YouTube live stream, right? But the main point is that now that you can see how bloated it is, you can also get an idea how much information you need to catch up on if you need to, see if this is affecting you. So some of these key points we're going to talk about probably have nothing to do with you. So you need to make sure you understand what's in here that's going to affect you directly, because there's some stuff in here that may affect your the industry you work in with your job and things like that, or it may affect your industry in proxy. Like it may affect an industry your industry works alongside. So if you don't know anything, or if you want to understand things, then you need to go in and dig this out. So we went through and saw how big the table of contents is, but we then found what we're looking for here, and we're looking for, does it show it here for you guys? It doesn't. Okay, let me pull this down a little bit. There we go. So what we found is we're looking for section 101.02. I don't know how you would say that. 10.102. How would you say that? But modifications to SNAP work requirements for able-bodied adults. So I don't know how we can actually just jump to that section. Is there a way to just jump to sections? Here we go. Amendments. And you kind of just, move through this exactly how you would any other social media site, any other website you would go through. Just click and learn things and read and things like that. So we obviously clicked the wrong link. We don't want amendments. We want to go back to text. We'll just get the text. and then we'll scroll down. And so we're looking for section 101.02. Okay, here we are. So 101.04, 101.03, and then we scroll up a little bit more. 101.102 or 101.02, modifications to SNAP work requirements for able-bodied adults. And that is what we are looking for on our Gemini list here, which is right here. And this is for Medicaid and SNAP. So I'm assuming they should be similar, but we will see. We will actually check and see if they're similar. So let's go back and then let's open up the bill. One more gain. All right, so let's open up the bill. Oh, we lost our spot. How did we lose our spot? All right, we'll just scroll down to it. And it gets, I'm starting to feel like it's a little easier to navigate this bill now that I kind of understand how it works. Okay, so 101.02. And we're just going to read and we're just going to figure out what it says and read it. So, modifications to SNAP requirements for able-bodied adults. So, exceptions. Exceptions, Section 6 of the Food and Nutrition Act of 2008 is amended by striking paragraph 3 and inserting the following. So, exceptions, which starts at paragraph 2, shall not apply to an individual if the individual is, so this does not apply to an individual, meaning a person, if the person is A, under 18 years old or over 65 years old. So these working requirements are accepted, or you were not affected if you are under 18 or over 65. Next, you were not affected by this if you are medically certified as physically or mentally unfit for employment. So you have to be an able-bodied, medically certified, physically fit person for this to affect you. But if you are unfit, this will not affect you. And then next it says, if you are a parent or other member of a household with responsibility for a dependent or child under 14 years of age, this will not affect your SNAP benefits. And then the next person that is not affected is if you're otherwise exempt under subsection D2, which we actually don't know, which we will learn. And also if you're a pregnant woman, this doesn't affect you. If you're an Indian or urban Indian, such as terms that are defined in paragraphs 13 and 28 of section 4 of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. So if you want to learn about the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, you can definitely look that up. More information there. And the next person that is not affected by the able-body requirements are a California Indian described in section 809 of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And I believe that is all of the exceptions. And so it continues to say in subparagraph A, by striking clause 2 and inserting the following, is in non-contiguous state that an unemployment rate that it is at or above 1.5 times the national employment rate. And by at the end of the following, definition of a non-contiguous state is in general in this paragraph that the term non-contiguous state means a state that is not one of the contiguous 48 states of the District of Columbia. So if this is already like confusing you, like you don't know what contiguous means, we will make this super simple. I'm actually just gonna scroll down and see where this ends so we can. Okay, so it goes in to show you how long the exemptions are and how long it's gonna last and things like that. But we're gonna actually break down what this means here. So we're gonna take this section right here, section 101 is 02. And we're going to scroll down and we're literally going to put this in AI. And we're going to have the AI kind of simplify what this means for us. So we're going to take this, scroll up, get the whole thing. Your parents aren't doing this, so I'm going to do this for them. If your parents are like, I don't like the big bill, or I love the big bill, and they didn't do this for you, we're going to figure out what's going on. So then we're going to do this, close this, and then we're going to open Gemini. And I have some more here we're going to cover with Gemini, of course, but let's go down here first. And then we're going to ask Gemini. We're just going to be real simple. Can you simply explain this section of the bill? And because Gemini knows I'm having a conversation about the big, beautiful bill, I don't have to give it context of what bill I'm talking about. It already knows because it's a smart AI thing. So let's see if it can. So it's reading it. So it says, it's still thinking a little bit. And remember this, it also mentions that some of this information could be like a little bit inaccurate, but you can double check it because we have the bill right here. So we're not gonna, again, it's a hammer. It's just a tool. We are smarter than the AI. So come on now, let's be proactive here. So it says that this section of the big beautiful bill, section 10102, makes significant changes to the work requirements for certain adults receiving SNAP benefits. And for those of you who don't know, SNAP is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So basically, if you make under a certain amount of money for your family, they can give you pretty much a budget so you can get groceries for nutritious foods. And it's commonly known as food stamps. So here's a breakdown. Who still doesn't have to work? Who has exceptions? And we went over this. We literally looked at it just now. This part of the bill updates the list of people who are exempt from having to meet the work requirements for SNAP benefits. So these people do not have to meet the work requirements that will be newly set. Previously, there were certain groups who had to work or participate in job training to receive SNAP. This section says those work requirements do not apply to, and as we saw, young people under 18, old people over 65, anyone medically unable to work, parents or guardians with a dependent under 14, people who are already exempt under other parts of the law, pregnant women, and then certain Native American individuals. This includes Indian or urban Indian as defined by specific sections of the Healthcare Improvement Act. We literally just read that. So we read it for ourselves. We asked AI to look at it. AI is pretty much reading it right back to us. So we understand a little bit more about how people who have SNAP will be affected going forward, right? But then it even breaks it down in even simpler terms. It says if you fall into one of these categories, you generally won't be required to work or look for work to get your food assistance. It even just says it in one sentence. If you just want to explain it to grandma and she don't need all the extra jargon, right? And it goes in to break down the rest of the section. So we'll go ahead and read that as well. So it says how waivers work for work requirements are handled and the standardizing enforcement and waivers for non-contiguous states. And before we do that, we're going to ask Gemini to define contiguous. I want to make sure I spell it right too, because this is a new word for me. Contiguous. And define non-contiguous. And then we'll scroll back up and then we'll check it. So now we're pretty much making Gemini work as kind of like a desktop or a canvas for our learning, right? So in the context of geography and particularly with reference to the United States. So it's still maintaining context of our conversation about the bill here, right? Contiguous means touching or connecting or connected in a continuous series, sharing a common border or boundary. So when we talk about the contiguous United States, we're referring to the 48 states that are connected to one another without being separated by water or another country's territory. So this excludes Alaska and Hawaii. So of course, New York, Philly, Maryland, Virginia, all those states that touch, right? Non-contiguous means not touching or not connected in a continuous series. So clearly Alaska and Hawaii. The bill you provided, which is right down here, also clarifies that for its purposes, Guam and the Virgin Islands of the United States are also considered non-contiguous and specifically excluded from certain non-contiguous state provisions as they are islands far from the mainland. So Guam and Virgin Islands, I wonder if Puerto Rico plays. Oh, it says in the bill language about SNAP requirements, non-contiguous states refer specifically to Alaska and Hawaii, and by implication, U.S. territories like Puerto Rico. which are also not part of the contiguous 48 states. So it's even including Puerto Rico. So basically that's all that means. So then when we hear this word here, how waivers work, how waivers for work requirements are handled, and standardizing enforcement waivers for non-contiguous states. So when they're talking about how they're going to enforce the waivers that are for work requirements in places like Guam, Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii, that's all it means. So now we know. So let's make it easier to understand as we move on. So it says that this part deals with how states can get exceptions from the work requirements, especially for certain areas. So before we move on, that makes my brain start clicking on thinking like, okay, maybe if I live in Guam, it may be a different kind of living situation where I may need to have some kind of assistance and not be able to work because maybe there just isn't an industry in Guam. Like there's no, DoorDash where I can make a living. But let's see, that's where my brain goes, but let's see. So it says changes to existing waivers. So it says it modifies a rule about when states can waive work requirements due to high unemployment. Now, it specifically states that if a non contiguous state, meaning Alaska or Hawaii, excluding Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands, has an unemployment rate at or above 1.5 times the national employment rate, they can get a waiver. So before, Alaska and Hawaii, if they had over 1.5, the national employment rate, they could not get a waiver. They still had to figure out how to get work with that unemployment rate, and then they could meet the requirements to get benefits. But now they don't have to. Now, if their unemployment rate gets above 1.5 of the national employment rate, they can get a waiver. But this is a stricter condition than what might have been in place before in some areas. So it may mean that before it might have been easier to, get benefits, but now in certain areas, you're going to have to make sure that you meet this threshold of above 1.5 times the national unemployment rate, which in one sense makes me think that you would then have to be in a pretty bad situation for your area in order to get this waiver, because there would almost have to be neglect. Like you would almost have anti-work, like people are just choosing not to work or companies are not offering jobs type of thing. But that's pretty much what I would think makes uh that change work. And then it says the new waiver for Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. It says that it creates a new temporary waiver program specifically for these non-contiguous states, Alaska and Hawaii. And it says that these states can ask the Secretary of Agriculture for an exemption from the work requirements. To get this exemption, the state must show they're making a good faith effort to eventually comply with the work requirements. This includes showing what steps they're taking, any major challenges they face, like funding or system issues, and a detailed plan with a timeline for full compliance. So basically, they are willing to give them exemptions for the work requirements, but it has to feel like they're going to earn it. So the Secretary of Agriculture will probably have some kind of way for them to check and see, or some kind of rubric for whether or not these are good faith efforts. I think the only contention you can probably come up with is good faith effort can't really be defined. So we don't know what that would look like. But if they're going through something that's clearly like a natural disaster, then we can think about that. If they're going through something like, like a foodborne illness, maybe, or something crazy like that, um, you can do things like that. But if you just have a large group of people that just can't work or not willing to work, you kind of can't fund that. You can't make that exempt and then start giving these people food stamps. That doesn't really make sense for the overarching process that this is. And then it says this exemption is temporary, expiring no later than December 23rd or December 31st. I said that all wrong. 2028, and cannot be renewed. So if you do get on this, you pretty much have until then to get back on your feet before they cannot do it anymore. And then it says the secretary can end the exemption early if the state doesn't submit required progress reports. So again, if you're not up to date, meaning making a good faith effort, honestly, it probably just sounds like communicating. Um, yeah, the state can end the exemption early, meaning once it ends early, it cannot be renewed. So you definitely will have to be on your P's and Q's as a state. And then it says states granted this waiver must submit quarterly reports on their progress and any new challenges. So quarterly, if you don't know, just means if you take 12 months out of the year, you break them up into 4 parts, quarters, and you get 3 months. And so every 3 months or 90 days, they want to know if you're actually doing better, if it's gotten worse because maybe more challenges popped up. How can they help you? They just need to know every 90 days, right? And so again, AI gives you a quick, simpler snapshot right here below. And it says in simpler terms, this means that states like Alaska and Hawaii, due to their unique circumstances, like potentially higher unemployment or logistical challenges. So I can imagine Hawaii being a place where there's just more people, not enough industry. And then a place like Alaska just being a place where like all your food has to be flown in or shipped in. It can be kind of weird. And then it says these can apply for temporary relief from the standard SNAP work requirements that the rest of us over here in the 48 contiguous states have to deal with. But they do have to show they're working towards meeting those requirements in the future. So they have until December 31st, 2028 to get their states up to the point to where if they do want these SNAP benefits, that they will eventually meet the standard SNAP work requirements, since this waiver is not permanent. And then overall impact, this section of the bill generally expands the categories of people who are exempt from SNAP work requirements, especially notably adding certain Native American groups. However, it also tightens the conditions for states to get waivers from these work requirements, particularly by limiting the duration for new waivers for non-contiguous states. So what this pretty much means to me is like if you're on SNAP right now and you're a 19 to 64-year-old able-bodied adult with no kid under the age of 14 and you're not pregnant and you're not a Native American, you pretty much can get SNAP, but you would have to meet the work requirements. And it doesn't actually tell us what the work requirements are. So let's see if the bill tells us. Let's open up the bill and then we'll just kind of like look through and see if the bill tells us what the work requirements are. And then we'll move on to another section. So let's see here. We actually did go through this entire section. So it actually won't tell us. So let's see if Gemini will tell us, because we would have to search the bill and we don't have time for that. We're going to actually find Gemini, open this up, and then ask it. So I asked it, what are the work requirements for the new SNAP changes? And again, it already understands the context of our conversation. All right. So I believe it kind of is just telling us who's exempt. But there we go. We have a general work requirement definition, and it's actually giving me way more information than I asked for. Okay, so let's get into it. We'll get into this and then we'll check out one other part of the bill as well. So the one big beautiful bill significantly alters the work requirements for SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, commonly known as food stamps, right? And so here are some of the key points. Expansion of age for work requirements. So there's an increased age limit. The bill raises the upper age limit for able-bodied adults without dependents. So that's actually an acronym. I didn't know that was a thing. So the healthcare industry has an acronym for able-bodied adults without dependents who are subject to work requirements. Previously, this limit was generally 54 years old, and the big beautiful bill increases this to 64 years old. So two things about that. You can get benefits longer. Okay, so it adds 10 more years to how you can get benefits. But it also means that you are 50, 60 years old with no dependents. So you being on SNAP would be taking from the people who have dependents, right? And usually people in their 50s and 60s have one or two to three dependents. So if you were to compare households, let's say you had a couple, they're both in their 50s and they don't make enough, so they want to get on SNAP, they would have work requirements versus the parents who were in their 50s and 60s, and let's say their kids are 14 for some reason, right? They would be exempt from the work requirements. So that's how that would work. So I think essentially most people would have an issue with this because now it would make, if you have dark mode activated, now it would make, if you have, let's say, a able-bodied adult, meaning you can work, and they don't have dependents, but they don't make enough, this person can no longer be on SNAP, right? And so that might be someone you know. That might be somebody you care about. But then how do they, stay on it if by this point in their life, like they're 55, 56 years old, they haven't amassed a skill by this point to keep a stable job, right? So this is where kind of I see people bringing up the slashing of the people getting benefits and how it's going to work, because there are people who have gone pretty far in their life on these benefits or on the assistance, right? And so what is this person to do if they're 55 years old and now they have to pretty much get up and work in an industry or a society where they may or may not have the skills? And that could look like a bunch of different things, right? But let's say, for example, I'm 32. I just aged up 30 years, right? I'm 62 years old and I got to go to work tomorrow. The levels of skills I have, they're good enough to exercise, but they're not good enough to compete to maybe make a living for like my medical bills or like the pills I need and stuff like that, right? So there is a incentive for people who are younger to kind of have stability when it comes to how they're going to, manage their money, and also how they're going to manage their work life balance, right? So if I'm like a 55-year-old person and the only thing on my resume I could probably get is like a Walmart greeter, the first thing I'm thinking of as a 32-year-old person with, like, let's say, foresight of that problem, I would get into financial services. I would learn how money works and solve people's problems quickly. Like, if not financial services, some kind of way where like I'm helping people solve their problems quickly. The issue that probably brings up for a lot of people is that it's sales. Like, you're gonna have to be good with people, and people are gonna have to like you. But again, if you're in your 50s and you don't have the habits or the skill set to get up and do this, is there's going to be a learning curve. So now you have to wait even longer before you do this, and this is just so you can get SNAP benefits. So this is not to push you into being a better citizen. This is just so you can get benefits at 50, 60 years old, right? That's where I can see this being an issue. Now at 30 something years old, you're an able-bodied adult without dependents. I don't think this should be much of an issue for you, unless you're of the mindset that you don't, maybe you just don't know or have certain skills. Maybe you're in a similar situation where you just, you just don't know. You just don't have these skills to know what the market is asking for. Maybe you're not tech savvy. So like, working a phone, technology and stuff like that, there's a learning curve there. I can see that being an issue, but then that just speaks to it being a education thing, not necessarily, any other issue. You just got to get your skills up and educate yourself. And that can look like a lot of different things. So from, it says 18 to 64, they don't meet exemptions. All of those ages, you can definitely get, some kind of skill or education to meet these benefits. But I think the idea with these changes is that to get you either on these benefits and earning the benefits, but also eventually not needing them, right? I think that's the key point here. And I kind of just explored a little bit of why it would work for you to not need them. Because if you can do some of the things that I was saying, you wouldn't really look at these as benefits. You would look at it more as just assistance, you know? So the next thing is there's stricter rules for parents, changes for parents of older children. So this bill removes an exemption for parents with children aged 7 or older. Previously, any parents for a dependent child was exempt, but now parents with children 14 years or older must meet work requirements. Some sources also indicate a change for parents of age 7 or older with an exemption if married and living with a spouse who also complies with work requirements. But this provision is set to sunset, so they might not keep that one. The core change is that simply having a dependent child no longer automatically exempts you if that child is older. So, from my understanding, is there are some households where if they had like one or two kids or things like that, they would get benefits. And if the caretaker or guardian wound up making a certain amount of money or a certain amount of hours, that would mean they didn't need it, right? They were earning enough money. But this removes that to kind of set it to where when the child gets of a certain age, and it looks like the age being 14 was probably chosen because that's around the age when you could start earning money as a young citizen. So you could, I know at certain jobs, you can work like super part-time hours, but you can start earning a bit of a living around like 14, 15, 16 years old at certain jobs. And I'm thinking that's probably the mindset around developing this here, right? So also, I don't know about this 7-year-old part of this exemption, but it seems like they're also trying to really focus on keeping households together as far as last names instead of having so many disjointed people in different households all benefiting from SNAP. So, for example, if you had a single parent, they're on SNAP benefit, and then that single parent's co-parent also trying to get benefits with their new family, it just creates, a bigger usage and less bandwidth for the overarching SNAP benefit program, right? So if you have more tight knit households that are just in units on SNAP, it makes the overarching program function a little bit more efficiently as far as money, right? And benefits too, because then you have, an easier way to organize a lot of this information. The next thing it says is general work requirement definition. So this is going to just be across the board, right? So for those subject to the work requirement, which are the people we named above, they generally must work at least 80 hours a month. So before I thought it was 40. Maybe it changed. Maybe this is incorrect. We can double check that. But it says this can include paid work, volunteer work, or unpaid work. So I can see this being this can be pretty cool because that means that you don't necessarily have to, work a job you may not have the specific skill for. You could probably do volunteer at your local church. I'm sure there's unpaid work you can do if you have like a nonprofit or something like that, or if you work at a nonprofit where I've known some jobs where they'll have a contractor maybe having the contractor do custodial work for a venue. I'm a musician, so like there's a music venue, but they need people to pick up the trash and clean up after the show. But they will hire a contractor to find basically employees to work with, and he'll pay them out of pocket, right? Technically, the guy didn't have to pay us the job I saw, but that could be a way to where you can track your hours because he is running a legit contracting business, right? Maybe he can pay you in other ways. Then it says, if you participate in employment and training programs, oh, you have to do that. So yeah, they want you to get so if you want to be a part of this program, and like I said about the earlier example, if you're like an older gentleman or even somebody who lacks the skills, they're saying part of the work requirements is that you are learning new skills. You're getting employment training or you're just joining training programs. So that can look like a number of things. That can look like probably YouTube University. They have Google. They give out certificates as well. There's Coursera. There's websites like that that give you a lot of different certificates and things like that. And then some jobs as well. They have their own training programs that will give you certificates, and you can pretty much go to community colleges, technical colleges. There's some hospitals that'll give you certificates and things like that. And then if you really want to get down to it, you can learn a language. You can teach a language. So there's a lot of skills that you can get. But again, it comes down to kind of doing what I'm doing here, using my mouthpiece, my brain, and talking. Like I'm not physically doing anything, but if I was, that would just add on top of all the skills that I have in the brain, right? And then it says you must not refuse a job offer or participate in training. So the idea again about you being on SNAP benefits, the bill is pretty much making it for people who are almost in dire need of work, right? So that way, the people who truly need it, which were on that exemption list, will be the ones that get it. And then they also extended the exemption list, and we already went over that a few times. We went over the waivers for different states and how it can be beneficial for the different states and things like that, and the temporary waivers. So I think that's pretty much a good portion for the SNAP benefits part. So let's find another section that we can go over and figure out how we can get a little bit better understanding of the big, beautiful bill. So one thing that I was trying to get to on this bill was that there was a lot of people who were worried about, where's it here? Not Medicaid, not tax cuts, not the environment. There was a big focus on, I think it was the tax cuts. Yeah, it was the tax cuts. It was raising the debt ceiling. That's what it was. Yep. The national debt ceiling. So tax cuts. So pretty much a lot of the problems that you're going to see when it comes to like taxes and stuff like that is how the taxes are used. It's not necessarily, well, I mean, a big part of it is how we get the taxes, but more so if you had a lot of money, right? Somebody won the lottery. There's two kinds of people in the world. There's a person who wins the lottery and blows it, like just spends all the money. And then there's another person who makes the money work for them, right? And so those two opposing philosophies are pretty much the biggest contentions that I've seen for this bill. And it's because in this country, and specifically America, we have a consumer culture, meaning when a new iPhone comes out, a new PlayStation comes out, we have people that just, their body just swipes a credit card. There's nothing they can do. They're just gonna swipe the credit card. There's nothing they can do, right? And then there's another group of people who don't necessarily just have to swipe the credit card, but they do have to get value from it, right? So maybe they're not buying the PlayStation, but they'll buy the PlayStation stock or the Sony stock, right? Or maybe they won't, buy the sports car, but they'll, invest in the sports car company. Both of these people have, this kind of like, I need to make money kind of attitude. But at the end of the day, they have two different approaches. And the approaches satisfy two different things. Both satisfy happiness, but one satisfies happiness in a different way. So like you'll get gratification instantly if you were to buy like a big old house for your family because you won the lottery. But you'll get gratification later when you are 64 years old and you no longer meet the work requirements for SNAP and you don't have to rely on that anymore. You see the difference? So there's a big difference, or a big polarizing conversation in those two working philosophies. Whereas there are some people who they've been getting instant gratification where now that they cannot anymore, they need some assistance. And then there's other people who don't really need the assistance up front, but the gratification they get at the end, they still want to make sure it's worth it, right? They still want to have what they were building or investing in at the end. So it's not necessarily a rich versus poor thing. It's about how can this make sense conversation, So when we look at tax cuts and their impact on the deficit here that we have in this country. I believe we're at like a 32, 33 billion. Is it billion or trillion? One of them big old aliens. But we have a lot of money we owe the world here, right? And in a nutshell, before I read this, the idea here is that we're going to take out a little bit more of the loan so we can use a little bit more of that money to make proper purchases so we can start paying down the debt, right? That's the idea, right? So it's like when you go and buy a credit card and you're like, all right, I'm gonna take out a credit limit of $1,000. I swear I'm gonna make my monthly payments. That's what we're saying. So that's the idea here. But it goes in to say that the permanence of the 2017 tax cuts. So it says that the bill makes permanent many of the individual tax cuts from 2017, from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which were set to expire. While proponents argue this provides tax relief for the middle and working class, critics contend that the largest benefits accrue to wealthier individuals and corporations. So before we go further, we got to ask, what is the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? So my brain goes to that the tax cuts will probably help corporations more because corporations in general and the wealthy pay more taxes, because after you make a certain amount, the country just taxes you a bigger amount. So if you're making more money than most Americans for a longer amount of time, you have just in nature paid more taxes, right? And so let's see what it says. It says the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 was a massive overhaul of the U.S. federal tax code signed into law by President Donald Trump. It was the largest tax reform in decades and had significant impacts on both individual taxpayers like me and you and businesses like Google and your mom and pop shop down the street. So here are the key points. Corporate tax rate reduction. The major change is that this was arguably the centerpiece of the act. The corporate income tax rate was permanently reduced from 35 to a flat 21%. So the goal for that is that proponents argued this would make U.S. businesses more competitive globally and encourage investment and bring jobs back into the U.S. Okay, reading that as it says what it says makes a lot of sense. It makes sense. And the reason why is because we'll break it down. The corporate income tax rate was reduced from 35 to a flat 21% rate. So the reason it makes sense is because ideally, when you're thinking about a capitalistic company, they should be using this extra income to invest in themselves, invest in new technology, and invest in research, which should open up opportunities for employment. Meaning, like, if you have a company that makes, let's say OBS uses this streaming software so you guys can watch this stream, right? If OBS decided they wanted to use this reduction of taxes and use the income that they're saving on spending the money on taxes to, let's say, add a little bit more infrastructure to their software, or maybe actually get, like, representatives that you can get calls to and things like that, so they can help you set your streams up and things like that. That opens up jobs for coders, engineers, UI, UX individuals to help them build the infrastructure. Or in my other fake hypothetical example, it gives people like me and you remote jobs or even hybrid jobs where we can actually work in sales and possibly tech, or like not tech, but yeah, tech, information technology, so we can help people fix their software and get their live streams running. And then if you have a big enough vision, you can have your company, in my example OBS here, the streaming company, partnering with certain media networks, so that way you can be their in-house streaming network. But you can't do that if you're being taxed and you're not making enough to beat the taxes. So this only really wouldn't affect you if you were making so much money that this 35% income tax on your corporation didn't matter. But if you were a corporation and you were getting hit with 35% and you're just a mom and pop textile company, or you're a mom and pop, like you do signs, like you basically design logos and signs for businesses in your area, this helps a lot. This is going to help you save money and keep it back. Now, the only way this would be terrible is if you're a company that has a horrible agenda, like you use your profits for like nefarious things, right? But that's the point. Like you want people to operate in good faith because they're being taken care of. But if you're just an evil person, you're an evil person. That doesn't change, the tax rate cut. So if you read it, it sounds great. Now, what will you do with what sounds great? So let's see what the next one says. So the individual income tax changes, which were temporary at the time, says that lower tax rates generally lowered income tax rate across most income brackets. So for example, the top individual rate dropped from 39.6%, which I think was the highest one, to 37. This is not a lot at all. But again, that's a big number if you're like making a lot of money. So I think that's where people think this only benefits the rich because that's where you would feel it. But honestly, that still makes sense. Like if you want more people to have their money, then they can have it. Now, again, if you don't like rich people because you think they're just gonna be mean to you, then yeah, you might not want them to have more money. But this would make sense if you are a person who wants to use money and keep more of it in your pocket. Increase standard deduction. The standard deduction, which is the amount of income you can deduct without itemizing, was nearly doubled. Oh shit. This meant fewer people would itemize deductions. Excuse me. So let me read it again. The standard deduction was nearly doubled. This means fewer people would itemize deductions. So I don't really understand what that means. So let's ask Gemini, because I think I misunderstood it when I said, oh shit. What I thought that meant was, I thought they were saying the options for items that you can deduct your taxes from has doubled, but let's see. I may be wrong. This refers to one of the biggest changes in the tax cuts made. In tax terms, a deduction is an amount of money that you're allowed to subtract from your gross income to arrive at your taxable income. The lower your taxable income, the less the taxes you owe. So if you had $100,000 in a year and that's your gross, and they wanted to tax you on, what was it, like 36%? If you lowered that number because you were deducting it for, let's say you were deducting your gas mileage, you were deducting business equipment, maybe lunch meals and things like that, that $100,000 starts to get knocked down, and you can probably get it lowered to where now you're only being taxed, your taxable income meets a different tax bracket. And that's the game I think most people don't like being played, because you have to be disciplined, like really disciplined to do that. It's like seeing the guy with muscles walk into the party and you haven't done a push-up all year. That's kind of what that feels like. But I think for most people, once you understand that, that kind of it just makes sense. Like, yeah, if I could pay, for a lunch that's like $60 and call it a meeting because I had it with two other people and we talked about business, yeah, I would do that. I would easily do that. So a standardized deduction from itemized deduction. So we're trying to figure out what they mean by doubling the itemized deduction. So when you file your taxes, the IRS gives you two main options for how to take deductions. Standard deductions, which is a fixed dollar amount set by the IRS. It's a simple, straightforward deduction that most people take because it doesn't require you to track specific expenses. The amount depends on your filing status. So if you're single, married, filing jointly, or if you're the head of household, and can be higher if you're 65 or blind. So this is the standard deduction that I assume comes out of your paycheck. It just comes right out of your W-2s. Itemized deduction. So this involves listing out specific eligible expenses you paid throughout the year. So this is more so for your entrepreneurs, maybe your actual business owners and the corporation themselves. And this can, common itemized deductions include state and local taxes, which are capped at 10,000. So you can only, if you paying, your state taxes, you can only cap off 10,000. After that, you owe. Home mortgage interest. So you're paying a mortgage, the interest on it is deductible. Charitable contribution. So if you donate, this is a big one that a lot of people will notice or point out. Like if you see somebody, give a girl a washing machine and they've been dating for like 3 months, they're gonna be like, it's a charitable donation because she works for the company type thing. So that's usually what people point out when they see that kind of stuff. Then you would deduct that from what you owe from taxes, and then the IRS says, So the next thing it says certain medical and dental expenses that exceed a percentage of your income. So that's actually pretty cool. So if you have like a big old, you get your whole veneers kicked in and you got to get them repaired, but it goes way past your income, you can deduct that because that's probably like a life event type of thing. I wonder what that's called. There's probably a word for this. And then the other thing is other expenses, although many were eliminated or limited by the TCJA. So I wonder what was eliminated. And pretty much it goes into what a deduction is and it gets into the changes here. So this is what we're looking for. But before the TCJA, the standard deduction was a much smaller amount. Many people, especially homeowners with mortgage interest or those with significant charitable donations or medical expenses, found that their itemized deductions added up to more than the standard deduction. So it made financial sense for them to itemize. So all that's really saying is, like, if you took the standard, like the just the percentage that the IRS gives you, let's say if you had 100,000, they only took off 10 because it's just what they offered, right? That's just the standard. But then you realize one year, if you actually accounted for all your mileage, if you accounted for all your business lunches and all your meetings, the clothes you bought for work and things like that, you actually wound up cutting off $11,000. So for most people, when they realized that, they started to itemize. And then it says here that the TCJA nearly doubled the standard deduction. So now I understand it a whole lot better now. So the TCJA doubled what that standard would be for people who didn't itemize. So if they didn't maybe feel like it or didn't feel it was worth their time to sit there and, itemize their gas mileage for their family, they doubled the standard to give them a little bit more incentive to just be able to just pay it instead of just, lying, essentially. So, for example, a single filer, it went from 6,500, I'm sorry, in 2017 to 12,000 in 2018. These amounts adjust annually for inflation. So the amounts possibly could go up and you could get more deductions. But here's why that meant fewer people would itemize. And remember, itemizing is where you just are picking each individual purchase or, deduction for yourself versus a just overarching standard deduction. So here's why fewer people would choose to itemize. There would be a higher hurdle with the standard deduction now much larger, and individuals' itemized deductions had to exceed this significantly higher threshold to be beneficial. So all that really means, which is actually a good thing, means that if you were to just try to make a bigger deduction in your taxes, then you would have to work harder to do so. Or you can just pay the standard and not have to work as hard. That's what that means. Because if, again, you had a $12,000 standard deduction, in order for you to meet that, you would have to spend $12,000 in deductions. But if your business normally spends less than that, then it would make sense for you to just, take the 12,000 deduction instead of trying to make your life miserable trying to meet, 13,000 to try and make it make sense for your taxes. And then also, of course, it continues to say simplicity wins. For many taxpayers, their various itemized expenses, even when added up, no longer surpass the new higher standard deduction, just like we said. It became much easier and more beneficial to just take the standard deduction. This saves them the hassle of collecting receipts and keeping detailed records for all those individual expenses. So yeah, it's really just to save you, time and hassle, especially if you're a type of business person that just wants to go and just work. You don't want to think about it, right? Now, it would probably behoove you to still keep detailed records of these things, but it doesn't really make as much sense to use it as a tax deduction. So that's all it really would change, right? And then it says the elimination or limitation of other deductions. So on top of doubling the standard, the TCJA also eliminated or severely limited several common itemized deductions, like the cap on salt deduction, which was, what was salt? Salt was state and local taxes. So the cap on state and local tax deductions at $10,000 and eliminating miscellaneous itemized deductions for unreimbursed employee expenses. This further reduced the total amount many people could claim if they itemized, making the standard deduction even more attractive by comparison. So it kind of, yeah, and so people were kind of probably itemizing their state and local taxes and then trying to get their federal taxes deducted on top of that. And so this put a cap on there. And it severely limited common itemized deductions that would probably help that, happen with the state and local taxes. So they're basically trying to nudge people towards using the standard deduction, but also giving them way more. Now, in a grand scheme, if I were to just get my mind going, this would help the country in the sense that you kind of just get more people just giving a general if you were to think like insurance, like if they were giving a general across the board number, you would see more consistency. But if you only seen like the rich guy giving all the taxes, but then the rest of us working class people only gave a little bit, then that's where you get the big spikes of like who controls, benefits and things like that, or who's really getting benefits. So it kind of evens the playing field, especially when you are realizing that most people would prefer convenience. They would prefer not to have to sit there and itemize all your things like that, whereas they're competing with a person who is itemizing the world and trying to get the most out of their salt and federal taxes. So it kind of evens the playing field, but then it goes back to the mindset thing I was saying earlier. So if you're a person who's, used to quick gratification, this is not going to make a lot of sense. But if you're okay with delayed gratification, then this would make a lot more sense, because then you can actually think about the overarching reason for why you would want the standard deduction for your company and where your company lives, which is the government it's under. So just to keep it simple, the government has a tax deduction that they want to offer. You can choose to itemize it and try to beat it if your company spends so much, in deductions. But if they don't, you can just meet the standard, right? And basically that would make it to where for most people who are cool with the convenience, or maybe not going to beat the deduction with their business, everybody can just kind of beat that deduction across the board. Whereas the person who's spending a lot more, let's say like Walmart or Amazon, they can still beat the deduction, but they will choose to be itemizing their stuff, right? Otherwise, they'll just pay the standard. And with that, they can kind of just level things out, right? The idea is that this helps your company because your company will be using the taxes that everybody's pretty much paying for the right reasons. The reason it cannot work, or the reason that this could fail, is that people will be frauding you. They will be misusing the taxes, or maybe putting the taxes in uses in places and organizations that you don't necessarily care for, which is why you want to be involved in what your government does with the taxes. So if you're not involved and you're just paying all these taxes, then yes, you will be screwed. You will eventually be screwed. But if you're very involved, then you will have some say. You may not win all the time, but you will have some say because you are involved. And that's the key thing. So that's why we're reading this. We're making sure we understand that. So the permanence of the 2017 tax cuts. We are back where we were. We did a little sidestep so we're going to get some understanding, and then we're back where we were. And it says that the bill makes permanent many of the individual tax cuts from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which were set to expire. While proponents argue This provides tax relief for the middle and working class, which is what I just explained, meaning like they don't have to be as detailed to get itemized deductions, and they may actually wind up getting more in their deductions depending on how their business is run. Critics contend that the largest benefits accrue to wealthier individuals and corporations, which technically is true. If you basically have more in deductions, you will get a bigger benefit. But that technicality isn't really going to contend with the reality that is there. So, yes, if you spend more, you will get a bigger benefit. But if you don't make as much, you will get a bigger benefit because of the difference it used to be, right? So you just get another opportunity or a greater opportunity than was what was offered before. So the critics don't really have a point. They just have a fact. They have a fact, but not really a point. So the next part we have here, and we'll close out with this one, and then we'll probably explore this again because I do want to get into things about not necessarily immigration, but more about the energy and the overarching country things. But we'll get into the next part here, which says increased debt deficit. And this was the next part I was talking about. The CBO estimates the bill will add significantly to the federal deficit, and it says it will add another 3.3 trillion. So I'm assuming we're in 33 trillion dollars in debt. And so this will add another 3.3 trillion or more over the next decade. And it says opponents of this argue that this is fiscally irresponsible and burdens future generations, especially given the already high national debt. So this is something that many people argue with, and I think personally it just comes down to culture, right? So they are making a lot of sense where they say that does burden future generations. So we saw this with social security. Yeah, social security. We started to see a lot of the money that was getting put into social security not really going to the people that deserved it, right? So that's where they're talking about burdening the future generations. Like our kids will have to kind of like deal with how they're going to handle the debt. But the issue that this actually solves is that it provides you with credit, debt, basically, right? To where you can now use this money to kind of like implement different initiatives that you want. So if you want to do something like more EV chargers, like electronic vehicle chargers and things like that, if you do want to get more infrastructure for building actual warehouses and manufacturing in your country, based on where you are now, you can't do that without more debt. So if you want to grind up and do that, then there will have to be a change in culture. If you want to use the debt and make it work, there will have to be a change in culture. So if you want to just use this as it is, that means you will have to be pretty much following a budget to the T. And if you don't, then you're pretty much damning yourself. You're doing it to yourself. But if you're a person that's against this and you believe that you should kind of grind all the way up, you still have to function within that budget. The only difference is there's no wiggle room. So the reason people would use debt for most purchases is because it gives them the wiggle room to continue making money. Again, if you don't have a culture of making money or making a lot of money, then you won't basically dig yourself out of the hole you jumped into, which is why people do not want to pull out more debt for the country. They don't think that people, or in general, the government will make the right decisions as far as making sure they pay their debts because they haven't in the past. And it's usually how credit cards company works, banking companies work. They just use your habits and figure it out. So this is actually a very good criticism. Now, I don't know what their solution would be along with the criticism, but it is a very valid one. And then the next one, it says that SALT taxes, the state and local taxes, will be deducted. The bill increases the cap on SALT tax deduction. Oh, this is about the deductions. It won't be deducted. It's about them. So it says the bill increases the cap on the SALT deduction from 10,000 to 40,000 for households earning under 500,000. So if you're Yeah, okay. So this bill increases the cap on the SALT deduction from 10K So you used to only be able to deduct 10,000. Now, if your household, if your family is running up $40,000, you can run that up from your state and local taxes for deductions and save, as long as you're making under 500,000. So if your wife's making 300 and you're making 150, then you got 450,000 in a house income. You can now save another $40,000 in deductions. You just gotta, itemize it. And then it says, while this benefits some taxpayers, it's also seen as a boon for wealthier individuals in high tax states. So again, the numbers just kind of do what the numbers do. If you are spending more money, which means you're making more money, you will benefit more. And that's just how the cookie crumbles, essentially, with how taxes work. Because if you're paying all your taxes, you will get a bigger deduction just by how it goes. I think what most people will have an issue with again is what is done with the taxes. So if the richest guy on the block is dropping 40K in the federal tax bucket, or the not the federal tax but the state and local tax bucket, that's not a bad thing. The only way it would be a bad thing if that becomes leverage for the person who put it in there, which is probably the part that people are insinuating, but it's not said here, so we're not going to use that. You just say it's a boon for wealthier individuals, which, yeah, it literally is, because you're literally spending $40,000 worth of deductions, so they get deducted. That's the point of the deduction. So that's just how it works. And then lastly, it says tax on tips and overtime. This one blew up all over the internet, and I think it really blew up because people wanted to keep more money in their pockets. It just kind of goes back to the mindset thing I keep bringing up. If you're a person who believes in instant gratification, this makes sense. This is very exciting. But if you're a person who's thinking long-term gratification, this is exciting, but for a different reason. So it says, this bill includes new provisions allowing individuals to deduct a certain amount of tip, wages, and overtime from their federal taxes. So the key thing here is, clearly you want to get more money in your pocket, but how you get it is going to be key. So now you're going to start to see even companies rethink what overtime looks like, because you're going to see people trying to get overtime, but the skills don't necessarily demand it. And because this incentive is here, you're going to get some very highly skilled and probably really good workers that want to join in on this. But the idea of it making sense for a lot of companies, they have to think about this now, because they can't just start dumping out overtime, especially with people who aren't going to do a job well. So there's a cultural thing there too. But I think that's all we can really get into today. I don't want to make this episode too long, and then we can always come back to this if you guys really enjoy it. But this was essentially us reading the big beautiful bill. We're getting into the smart part of it. I'm gonna start helping you guys get a little more educated when you want to start seeing who's a musician and artist on stage telling you to do what. You can actually figure out what they're talking about and do it themselves. But now that we know how to explore a bill, we used AI to do it, so we did it in a futuristic, cool way, and we got to learn a lot about some cool new things that honestly I didn't know about either. But if this was fun, make sure you check this out. The next time, I will see you guys tomorrow night. We'll probably do a shorter episode depending on the topic, but I will see you guys tomorrow night at